what extent do you think this, not lack of contestation, but you say that actually the amount of contestation was less than you expected, can be caused because the political parties are not aware or they don't really know what's going on the European institutions or what's the plan for the etc. No? And also you put a specific example of the Labour British Party. Why do you think the Labour British Party doesn't participate on this debate so much, or why it doesn't take it as a key issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think scholars that are working on the why political actors, to what ends political actors are using a variety of different formal and informal settings within this multi-level field. One of the major point is that to get knowledge, really. And that's something that maybe it's not really coming from this research, but we also did the research with the think tanks in the same countries, trying to understand how the expert and expertise operates. And that we were asking the think tankers whether they work with the parliaments, sort of to provide, I mean, come on. This is the decade when those policies really required a lot of thinking. These are political actors that are not specializing in Turkey. They may not necessarily know what's going on in Turkey over the course of those years, and they need to make some decisions on it. And the same was the ENP, even to the greater probably magnitude was within the Arab Spring. And yet you can clearly see that it depends on the parliament. So in our case, we saw that specifically British Parliament was seeking for expertise, and obviously European Parliament to some extent. While Polish Parliament was, and Irish to some extent, Polish Parliament was, for instance, not really seeking the external expertise to get some more knowledge what's going on, even though in the Polish case you can know that they know what those policies are about when they speak about them, they make sense of them. I mean, probably very often to the general level, but still this is something that that is important. So it depends on the parliamentary culture, so to say. Again, scholars that are actually working on the parliamentary control of foreign policy, they say that we should look at the three different things. The one thing is the formal competence to control. The second is the capability to act. And the third one is really political culture that stands behind. So in some research you can find that some houses or some chambers, even if they are weak in the first and the second, they could develop the very engaged political culture to really get expertise and being engaged in supervising, very often obviously post factum, those decisions, but still being engaged. So that very much depends, but you can clearly see that they utilize a lot of the formal and informal structures to get that knowledge, to network, to make sense. Whether that leads, for instance, to the better understanding within the party groups on foreign policy, I'm not sure. This probably requires for the research to sort of find, I mean, I found many of the party groups very heterogeneous when it comes to the claims towards those specific policies. And that's something that is even more visible within the ENP than enlargement, I guess, which again goes back to the fact that enlargement probably is more ideologically driven, while ENP is still national preference is somehow, goes in the mix in a way.
Hi, I was wondering about, you kept coming back to value-based justifications and ideational frames, or identitarian frames.
Yeah.
Would you say, because England or Britain famously, British discourse lacks, is based on the utility argument. I don't know much about Poland, but if it's anything like the rest of the V4, I expect it has a great element of the utility justification to it. So do you think that lack is precisely because of the general nature of the discourse on Europe in those countries? And then subsequent question, if so, would you expect the other elements to be more prevalent or prominent in justifications for the ENP and the enlargement policy for countries like Germany and France?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that when it comes to the Yes, the national discourse in general is utility-based. That's true, and the British Parliament has its institutional features that are making this even more prominent. Yet, what I found interesting is, let's start with the Polish case. A lot of the things that in the EP level they say are implicitly understood on national level. For instance, one of the prominent claims that are used by Polish MEPs that are actually having cultural and identitarian elements are about Ukraine. And in Polish parliament, everybody says Ukraine belongs to Europe. Everyone knows that. So, you don't talk about it. It's implicitly understood what we talk about, right? So I think that is also kind of element, is that those sometimes, in the national level, you have a kind of tradition of discourse, right? That sort of, and very often it's also in case of Turkey, for instance, is that they just strategically not raising the issue, even though you know that there is an issue, because they indicate it, but they not spell it out, while they may or may not, in case of Britain, still in the EP, they rather not using this. It's also because it's more, it's very often it depends on the mode of discussion, right? Sort of if you have a different sort of format of a speech, this kind of, it's the analyzing parliamentary discourse, it has its fundamental limitations, right, that are inscripted in the format very often. So that in the British case, it's true, it's kind of takes it off, plus the fact that you don't have those usual suspects that are using those claims, right? So the rest is, but you have those kind of, mentioning that there is also this thing with Turkey, but we don't talk about it here, right? It's not a place to talk about it, because it's not a place to talk about it, because here we talk about the trade that actually is the point, or the fact that having Turkey in is going to benefit economically, or it's going to benefit us as Britain, as our preference in foreign policy issues, or something like that. So, but in the EP, it is interesting, while this is the place where you raised it. When it comes to the Germany and France, I think there is a research on, not on foreign policy, on politicization and cultural and identitarian frames, which shows by two scholars, they quoted somewhere along, I forgot the names now, who actually are showing that they exist in those national places. And interestingly, specifically in Germany, they also are driven not only by the radical party's presence, because that's something that scholars know, that the politicization is prompted as well by the radical actors, because they do that, and specifically they use the cultural identitarian frames to especially fuel it. And in Germany, you can see that without, because this research was done before parties such as AfD entered the parliament. So you can see this politicization, even if you don't have those elements, and still those cultural and identitarian frames, not used for foreign policy. And this actually is something that we probably need to do more and more, is to think and research politicization in the area of foreign policy. Because we only looked at two policies, but you know that if you look into the trade, right, you have people going to the streets against trade deals. The question is why they go for particular trade deals. What really prompts politicization within the foreign policy? My intuition here, based on this comparison, is that it must have something to do with your domestic community, right? It must have the effect on the citizens internally, so to say. So the foreign policy must have a direct link into the citizens in order to be politicized. But obviously this requires further research, I guess.
Other questions? Yes.
Actually, just on the last part that you said again about people demonstrating against the trade agreements and so on, there has been a lot of activism against it, of platforms collecting, a kind of petition style. That it was really driven by kind of interest groups or NGOs or transparency activists, but we don't have that in foreign policy, isn't it? Or in other, like this kind of
Yeah, I mean, we don't, but still some of the, but we have it in a trade policy, right? Which still has this, it's still another case of maybe law politics or foreign policy, right? It's not the hardcore sort of security issue, but I think it's, you know, to be honest, we also tackled on something that is called, and really it's driving interest of scholars, which is called populist foreign policy. I didn't even brought it here because it wasn't really about that in that lecture, but I think when you start reflecting on that one, when you actually see, I've been listening recently to a lecture by a former American ambassador to Europe, and he was saying, and he used the frame that, you know, the President Donald Trump occasionally is mobilizing his base, bashing NATO. And I wasn't really captured by NATO. I was captured by occasionally, you know, mobilizing his base. And this is something that we need to, so, you know, I know that in Europe it's easier to mobilize, you know, actors that you've just mentioned on a certain trade elements. But in the US, you can actually apparently mobilize people on issues such as NATO, which is hardcore security. Are we far from there? And that's something, is like, you know, is it impossible to think that you can actually have that mobilization based on, you know, things related to security? And I think that's something that should really, this is really why I was doing this in the first place, because I'm interested what happens. And, you know, it also has a very problematic sort of normative consequence in terms of what we do when this happens to foreign policy. If you guys look at the foreign policy cycle, many issues are never actually even entering the phase that I was showing you research on, right? They are done behind the closed doors, and this was how it was done. Some of this is maybe because of social media, maybe because of other things, maybe because of some people being interested of those being politicized. Many possibilities are here, but they possibly could be. And then it poses an issue for both our policymakers and for us academics and commentators to think and think ahead what would be consequences and you know, how do we react when it happens. And I think CETA case showed it very clearly. You know, one of the things that our policymakers are doing is sort of reintroducing this in a different format and so on, but that possibly not be the model for every case that is politicized. To sort of, you know, to change something, to bring it, I mean, as I'm referring here to the domestic politicization of issues and protests and sort of bringing, what I'm trying to say here, maybe I should stop really, is that we should think ahead in a way that this may actually happen, and it's already probably happening in some places, in some Western liberal democracies, and that's something that I found very interesting.
Thank you very much, Magdalena Góra. I don't see any additional questions at this point, but I think we have a lot to take home. I had a couple of questions, but I will ask them over a glass of beer. What is most interesting, I think, and we have been seeing this in a couple of lectures recently, especially on this topic, what are the crossroads between democracy and, let's call it, diplomacy? What keeps on being, so to speak, an area, a domaine réservé, if you like, in terms of the making of international relations, cooperation, but also European integration? Should we expose not everything to democracy, right? And also think perhaps about this as a way of democratizing foreign policy, but what are the implications, right? What are the unintended consequences, and what probably would we have to give in? While at the same time, good old diplomacy would enable us probably to go along the lines of how we have conducted European enlargement, European neighborhood policy, and other policies. Thank you very much for bringing up these questions. Thank you very much. A big round of applause for Magdalena Góra.
Thank you.
And last but not least, before you all go and have a glass of beer or whatever you like to drink, I would like to point out one last time that tomorrow 1:30. We continue, I guess, in a certain sense, this debate in our symposium, Europe Upside Down and Outside In, where we gather amongst many others, Magdalena Góra on the panel, but also Professor Michael Wintle and Dr. Angela Ilic, who has also joined us in the meantime, an alumna from European Studies of the year 2004, if I'm not mistaken. So, a lot to be looking forward to. Enjoy the evening, and we see all of you tomorrow for the symposium and for the honorary doctorate of Mark Marzer.